thanks so much for coming. It's a somewhat rainy and cruddy afternoon, but I'm glad to see you here. This is actually the last of our public events in the Color series. The series has been made possible by the usual and brilliant suspects. Jennifer Conway is the Associate Director of Penn Humanities Forum. Sarah Varney is our Administrative Coordinator and Technologist. Elizabeth Della Zazzara is our Research Assistant and Research Fellow this year. And especially Chi-Ming Yang, Professor in the English Department, also in the East Asian Studies program, also in Cinema Studies. This whole series has reflected the awesome range and subtlety of her own great scholarship. Chi-Ming is a comparatist. She works across nations, languages, cultures, regions, across disciplines. Her work is, of course, embedded in literary studies, but also theories of race and colonialism. She works on the economics of cultural trade, on the circulation of commodities and fetishized objects, and more. She's an amazing scholar, and she's been the ideal color director for us this year. So Chi-Ming is going to introduce Vanessa Schwartz, and let's give her warm thanks for the whole series as well as for tonight.
It has been a really terrific year of color-related lectures and programs. Everything from the Zadie Smith inaugural conversation through the Bradford Young film series and last week's lecture by Julian Ajiman on sustainable urban planning. And in various ways, we've been exploring the histories of colors like green, black, blue, yellow, and really everything in between. From all kinds of perspectives, really. Art, archaeology, chemistry, biology, music, engineering, literature and painting, and as Jim mentioned, even food studies. It's also been a year of color debates in the popular media as well. Conversations that straddle aesthetics and politics and ranging from the trivial to the grave, whether we're talking about the blog sensation of the blue dress, the so-called blue dress, or the ongoing and urgent call that Black Lives Matter. I would really love to thank especially Jim English and the Humanities Forum staff of Jennifer, Sarah, and Elizabeth for all of their hard work and for making this series possible. And also thank you for coming out to the events. I've really enjoyed learning all of these areas with you. Tonight, I'm very happy to introduce our final speaker of the season, Vanessa Schwartz. She is Professor of History, Art History, and Critical Studies, and she's the Director of Visual Studies, the Visual Studies Research Institute at the University of Southern California. And at USC, she also holds appointments in the Department of French and Italian. Professor Schwartz has won numerous awards, and she's authored numerous books on French history and culture, along with Western cinema studies, which have really shaped the field of cultural studies. Most recently, she's been researching the history of visual culture and media with wonderful titles like Jet Age, Aesthetics, Media, and the Glamour of Motion. And her recent publications include the very newly out book, co-edited book, Getting the Picture, The Visual Culture of the News. Next year, she'll be in our region, actually, at the New York Public Library at the Coleman Center. Now, in her earlier work on 19th century Paris, Professor Schwartz studied the interlinked sites of the city of Paris, from the morgue to boulevards and newspapers, which she aptly called, newspapers that is, non-fictive drama of contemporary life. She also studied in that book wax museums, which she describes as, and I'm quoting here, three-dimensional or living newspapers for the way that they staged current events at the time as tableaus. Tonight she's going to offer a different take on newspaper culture with respect to the advent of color photojournalism. So please join me in welcoming Vanessa Schwartz.
So I'm very glad to be here and to see some old friends as well from the various chapters of my increasingly long life, and also to meet new people and to be part of this really interesting series on color. My interest in color has been ongoing, actually, for many, many years. And then I was lucky enough to be a part of a color theme at the Getty Research Institute 3 years ago. And there I proposed to work on color news pictures as a part of the work I was doing on the culture of the Jet Age, where I was interested in the relationship of color to motion. And you'll see that, I hope, come out in this talk, but at the same time, I was and have always been interested in the visual culture of the news, and so this also relates to this question of photojournalism. So towards the end of his life in the 1970s, the legendary documentary photographer Walker Evans spoke for many people in summing up his view of color photography when he said, and I quote, "There are 4 simple words which must be whispered. Color photography is vulgar," unquote. I, of course, felt I had found my subject. Now, such an attitude frames the very difficult history of color photography in general and color news pictures more specifically, which is what I want to talk about this afternoon. Evans' attitude, though, is not idiosyncratic. In fact, it represents a much longer and more general history regarding color and aesthetic value. In The Voices of Silence, writer, critic, and eventually French Minister of Culture in the 1960s, André Malraux, noted, quote, that Athens was never white, but her statues bereft of color have conditioned the aesthetic sensibility of Europe, unquote. And although the attention garnered recently on work such as James Turrell's, both at LACMA and at the Guggenheim, he had retrospectives 2 years and last year at each important museum, suggests, I think, that we've come a long way in regarding the aesthetics of color. My talk hopes to situate this kind of situation as an uphill battle, and it puzzles over the rather problematic history of color, where you might think, in fact, it shouldn't be a problem at all, and that is actually in the history of the news. In an important reconfiguration of documentary photography, Brett Abbott describes what he called engaged observers as, quote, embracing the gray area between objectivity and subjectivity, information and interpretation, journalism and art. Here I show you the cover of Abbott's 2010 catalog, which was also connected to a Getty Museum exhibition of the same name. And this catalog and that show wisely muddied the waters of conventional distinctions between news, documentary, and art photography. Yet his invocation of gray, I would suggest, unwittingly draws attention to a blind spot in his own analysis, which was the history of color photography. So although Abbott meant to invoke the metaphoric expression of the color gray as a space that was indeterminate and in between, gray in his use here also reinforced the notion that both photojournalism and documentary photography are expressions that would be best suited to the gray scale and to black and white reproduction. But more interestingly, Abbott's catalog doesn't exclude color photography. He simply, in a sense, skips over it as a subject in and of itself, and he integrated color images with almost little or no commentary. So here in the show and in the catalog, he talked about Susan Meiselas's Nicaragua set of images that were then reprinted in a book called Nicaragua. And for me, when I saw that in his catalog, I really wondered, how did color, as it were, insinuate itself into documentary and news photography without ever having drawn sufficient analytical and critical attention to its history? So that was the kind of question that I wanted to ask as my point of departure. Now, not everyone here is maybe into the history of photography, so let me just briefly summarize some of the common truisms. Scholarship about the uses of color or black and white versus color in photography generally, I would say, identify a bifurcated development in which black and white denotes serious photography in both journalistic and artistic terms, whereas commercial photography produced in the service of mass consumption delighted in new technologies of color reproduction and used glossy magazines as vehicles to sell products and consumerism as a lifestyle. Even if that were true, no one has really, of course, explained why color actually sells, which is something that I hope we should be thinking about collectively. Art critic Max Kozlov expressed these pieties about photography in his 1975 observation about what he perceived to be new uses of color by asking what he considered to be a rhetorical question. Is there even a single picture of the Depression in color, he asked? And the answer, of course, was yes. He didn't know it, but there were 1,600 FSA, that's 1,600, FSA and OWI transparencies made during the Depression that Sally Stein, my colleague out in California who's recently retired from Irvine, discovered in her own research. So this, even the burying of almost 2,000 photographs or transparencies actually by one of the most famous documentary photography projects is something that I think we want to ask about. So why? Well, art critic Hilton Kramer, in 1975, in response to an International Center of Photography early color show, which was called The Eye of the Beholder, I think helped keep color in its place. He explained, these blow-ups of color photographs quickly settle, as color photographs so often do, into a series of pretty pictures. They simply cannot compete, whether as visual images or documentary reports, with black and white masterworks to be seen in other exhibitions, unquote. Critics like Kramer of color photography frame the opposition of color and black and white as a contrast between superficial brightness and a more profound intensity, as the experience of the naked eye versus a cultivated sensibility, as natural versus formal abstraction, as mass culture versus high art. So my job tonight will be to expose the question of color from the side, let's say, of the color boosters, rather than the color critics. In the process, I hope to establish that contrary to the declarations that, quote, color photography happened in a starburst, as curator Kevin Moore put it regarding the rise of fine art color photography in the 1970s, it's actually been more of a slow burn. Now, color news pictures have been neglected because they are twice cursed, first as color and then as journalism. In the history of photography, the Museum of Modern Art's 1976 William Eggleston show is always seen as a watershed for its recognition of color photography as fine art. But under Edward Steichen's direction, he was the curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art, that department had first long been interested in news and documentary. He put on exhibits like War Comes to the People, Image of Freedom, Road to Victory, Power in the Pacific, Memorable Life Photographs, and of course, that's the Eggleston image, and we'll come back to that at the end of the show, or the talk as well. Here, the Road to Victory, to give you a sense of what Steichen's curation was like, really blowing up pictures from actually magazines. And last, of course, he is responsible for the blockbuster, most famous photo exhibit probably in the history of the world, The Family of Man. And what's very interesting is many people, of course, think, in part because of the fame and celebrity of The Family of Man, that actually this is one of the reasons why we always see documentary and news photography as in black and white. But quite remarkably, no one talks about the fact that there was a color photo in the Family of Man show. And not only was there a color photo, it was the last photo. And not only was it the last photo, it was a 6-foot by 8-foot transparency. Because, of course, we'll talk about transparency in a minute in color. So it's like a big giant slide, as it were, of fire emitted from the explosion of an H-bomb. And here you can see an installation view of the image with children in front of it. But again, you kind of wouldn't know it was in color unless you happen to know and done some research and learned that it was in color, and it's never been reproduced in color in any book or article that talks about the family of man. So again, that's an interesting point of both repression of knowledge about color photography, but also, of course, I think it's very important that this last image was in color. Now, Steichen also organized less well-remembered shows than The Family of Man, and they were all about color photography, but no one talks about them. Elliot Porter's Birds in Color, 1943, the In and Out of Focus show of 1948, the 1950 all-color photography show, which featured mass magazine reproductions and was announced as the first in a series of color shows that MoMA was going to do in the 50s. The museum's press release asked, quote, "If Daguerre had invented modern color photography in 1938, would not photography today present a completely different picture?" Unquote. Finally, the last show prepared by Steichen at MoMA, and the first to open under the new young curator, John Sarkowski, was Ernst Haas's one-man show in 1962. And it's to the work of Haas that I'll eventually turn. Oh, this is the image by Wayne Miller that was originally published in Life magazine that ended up in The Family of Man. And here, Ernst Haas, and we'll talk about Haas, that's the image we used on the poster for this talk, but he had the first all-color one-man show in MoMA in 1962. At least, I mean, there was the Elliot Porter Birds, but this was actually a summary of Haas's work. It included a few of his black and white pictures, but the point of the show, as I said, is 1962, one-man show, and it was really putting color photography at the center. So these shows that I've enumerated and mentioned are totally dismissed, totally forgotten, and in a sense, they've suffered from the narrow context in the history of art that attempts to create a canon of fine art photography. Now, my goal is not to rescue them for that canon. Instead, I seek to locate color photography within the broader visual culture of which these pictures were initially a part, a field that considers the fact that fine art photography is and has always been a tiny fraction of the photos taken, printed, projected, and viewed, and that photography has been deeply tied to the evidentiary domain and as such has shaped all fields of knowledge and communication since its advent, and that connects these color photographs also to a broader material and symbolic history of color itself. So my question is really, what kind of news picture does color photography make? So to answer that question, I'm going to first contextualize by reflecting on the advent of what I'll call the modern color regime. Then I want to turn to the history of color photography as a technology, and then move on to color press photography in the heyday of photojournalism in the 1950s and 60s. And it's during this period that magazines transitioned to all color. And here you have an image from National Geographic, what we call the red shirt school of color photography, which is they would kind of throw red. They knew they were taking pictures in color, so they put people in red because they thought that was more visually interesting. This period also doesn't just happen in America, also in places like France. Again, magazines went to all color, and this is an interesting image from Réalité, which is one of the most important color magazines in France in the 50s and 60s. This by Jean-Philippe Charbonnier, but what I love about it is it really suggests the transition from black and white to color. So you see, in a way, the background image is of black and white, and then in the viewfinder, you see color. And this is also very interesting for the film buffs in the room. Looking at this image, you may perhaps think of the opening of Jacques Demy's Les Parapluies de Cherbourg. And again, it's not just, I would say, an interesting allusion. Actually, Demy's wife, Agnès Varda, had photographs in that very issue that I just showed you the cover of, and I'm quite sure that Demy was very familiar with that Charbonnier picture. So in other words, this is the period of the transition to color, but color wasn't just in magazines. In 1954, half of all American films were in color. And colored television began broadcasting in 1951. It saw a huge watershed in 1961 in NBC with the arrival of Walt Disney's The Wonderful World of Color. And by 1966, the major networks were running complete color lineups. And in fact, CBS inaugurated the 1966 year with Color Me Barbara to celebrate the fact this was a one-hour special. You will appreciate that it was filmed in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Half of it takes place literally, and they filmed it all night. They had to do a night shoot because they wouldn't let them close the museum. In any event, all color, Color Me Barbara, so that television is also very important to our story as a context, I think, for understanding what color meant in this period. So that's an immediate context, which gives you a kind of multimedia context regarding color. But let's back up a moment and consider color more broadly. So color is light that when separated produces an optical effect. Between optics, neuroscience, chemistry, and psychology, there are multiple sciences of color with changing histories. And I, of course, cannot account for all of them here today, but I think it's important to think about it that way. Most of us believe, whatever our basis, that shapes stay in our minds longer than colors do, which is perhaps why form is considered more fundamental than color. Color changes, color fades. But our access to color is verbal as well as experiential, which is why its study can't be limited to the science of color. In other words, color is named, it's named through comparative distinction. Now, there's a rich literature about the symbolic dimensions of color, in which color, of course, functions as an emblem, a badge, a form of identification. Color is a sartorial mark of distinction in traditional societies. So here I show you the talon rouge of the king in Versailles, but of course also later, yellow stars and pink triangles in the concentration camps. Institutions in which small distinctions are deeply meaningful are very colorful, like the court, the church, the military, and schools. And here I just show you the different schools and emblems of Hogwarts for Harry Potter. There is also therapeutic culture and functional color, by which I mean color is thought to cure and, of course, to enhance visibility. So here, for example, the stop sign with its red, but color also can hide through camouflage. Now, synthetic or chemical color was born of an accidental discovery of mauve by William Henry Perkin in 1856 as a coal tar byproduct which made color as artificial, fabricated, and human-made as it was natural and true to life. So this kind of moment in the 19th century where color can be artificial, I think, and manufactured and synthetic is very important. In the 19th century, in fact, photography and color share a common origin in optics, but were also transformed by chemistry. This is a kind of key dimension, I'd say, of the modern era of color. Now, such artificiality could, of course, scream deception or embellishment or artifice. So, for example, here, two images I want to show you that were part of the Faking It show at the Met about artifice in photography, which was in a way an attempt to say, well, how did we get to Photoshop, or how new is Photoshop? And their answer was, you know, there's always been fake photography. And here, I think, applied color, both here and here's a great one for my friend Ben Nathans, Russia circa 1870, again, a hand-colored glass negative. And the point is people in the 19th century understood these to be hand-colored. They were artificial deceptions, and people accepted that as part of the history of photography. Now, Max Weber spoke, of course, of modernity as disenchanted, and synthetic color, in contrast, I would say, suggests that modernity was hardly the gray and rational place that Weber thought, and rather it was ever more colorful. A 1939 World's Fair guidebook described, quote, "A flood of multicolored light drenches the sky above, the glowing spectacle that is the fair at night, the city of magic." In other words, color, I'm suggesting, is a modern form of magic. And almost every kid's chemistry set is about essentially the magic of color. They all have, and almost all magicians do magic tricks, which are basically chemistry tricks. So color's seemingly direct appeal leads observers to associate it with a world without narrative, color is associated with spectacle. As Laszlo Moholy-Nagy observed about the Impressionists, quote, they were the first to suppress the narrative, storytelling element in painting in favor of the cult of color, and they were the basis of the art of Cézanne, unquote. So its association with spectacle is emblematized in Walt Disney World's kind of world of color, both here, the wonderful world of color from the television show, and it's still alive and well and kind of reanimated here currently at California Adventure in a new light and sound spectacle called World of Color. Now, such enchantment also made color feared in the modern world for its direct appeal, its sensuality, its seemingly archaic and primitive qualities. As the photographer Paul Outerbridge wrote, quote, color has considerable power because it appeals directly to the senses and the emotions, which are much older and more deeply rooted part of the race than is the intellect, unquote. There was a guy named Faber Buren who was a mid-century master of functional color. Functional color is the creation of a professional who could essentially help you get results from color effects. In other words, these were considered to fall within the realm of the emotional and psychological response to color. There is a book that deals with some of this by Regina Blaszek called The Color Revolution, and her book treats mostly the standardization of color and its commodification, all based, I think, in the belief of the perceptual punch of color, but her book doesn't really at all consider why color has its various meanings, and she kind of takes the position that, it's just part of consumerism and kind of goes from there. Color is, of course, a commodity. She is right. And in the modern era, as a commodity, it operates in a tight relation to novelty and supply. So when supplies are low, it's a gift. So Christmas issues of illustrated magazines in the 19th century would put color on their cover. This, the Illustrated London News, and this continues into the period when color photography starts to be more meaningful. And so here you have Réalité, December 1952. Very early uses of color in magazines in France, again, a gift for the Christmas issue of Réalité. But when it's plentiful, it often denotes variety. So here you not only have the comparison to the macaw on the side, but more importantly, you often see color in a palette in the modern world, which is to say an object that we can give you in any and every color. And that, again, suggests that what color offers is not just consumerism, but variety and choice. But last, and perhaps seemingly most relevant to color photography, color represents fidelity, realism, and truth, what was called and still is called living color. Color, after all, is information. As the mid-19th century lithographer Louis Prang put it, quote, color in a picture is always more satisfactory than the lack of it. And so here I show you a 19th century chromolithograph by Prang. But one could go on eternally about chromolithography. And when I wrote about Paris in the late 19th century, I did a lot with that subject. But basically what Prang was on about is the idea that color allowed people to present what he called life pictures. Now that photographer I earlier mentioned, Paul Outerbridge, who is a colorist of the 20s and 30s, complained that, quote, color states rather than implies, as does black and white. It is really quite a bit more difficult to handle by way of getting away from mere reporting and factual representation. So this would make color, you would think, seem totally suited for documentary and news photography. And yet its literalness always seems to imply some unsophisticated perspective. So color became, in its history, the domain of amateurs. So, for example, these distinctions were so obvious that when George Stevens, the important Hollywood director, went to Europe to film the Allied invasion and the liberation of the concentration camps for the US Army, he shot the official record for the Army in black and white, and he brought his own personal cameraman to shoot in color. And so here you have an image, the official imach of Dachau, This is a train car outside of Dachau, Stevens' official US Army footage in black and white, and yet you see his cameraman taking a picture of him taking the picture, and his cameraman took all color film. And of course, I don't need to belabor probably the most important and famous amateur color photos of the century, again, moving pictures, Abraham Zapruder's Kennedy assassination film. Again, one of the most viewed set of images in the history of news is in fact in color. Again, something that people really haven't thought or talked very much about, including the way in which they were published first in black and white in Life magazine and then subsequently published in color. So these many associations of color, symbolic and material, I'd suggest, are a way of providing a broader context for the color of news pictures. But so we now need to turn to kind of color photography. And as I suggested, colored photography already existed for anyone willing to take a brush to a surface. It's color photography whose absence has plagued the medium's advocates. And there are stories, and I don't have time to go into it, like that of the minister from upstate New York named Levi Hill, who claimed to have made the first color photographs in the 1850s. Now, actually, a partnership between the Getty Conservation Institute and the Smithsonian, which owned 62 holotypes, has determined that there was a primitive method of color photography that Hill used, but it was so augmented by hand coloring and a lot of self-promotion and hokum that no one can figure out from the scientific testing of the 62 holotypes actually what his process was. There are other early color processes, and again, people familiar with the history of color photography know about physicist James Clerk Maxwell's successful additional process of using 3 negatives and 3 projectors with filters to produce what we call the additive method of color photography. The history of color photography and its technology passes through a very interesting chapter in the history of the Kodachrome, and here the inventor, Louis Lumière, who also invented the movies in 1907, invents, as it were, another additive method through a screen of grains, colored grains of potato starch, actually. And this was, from the very beginning, connected to the press, because the very first Kodachromes in 1907 were also published in l'Illustration in a special additional album, so that they would be communicated to the public at large. So these are the kind of first published Kodachromes by a guy named Léon Gimpel. But it also must be said that there are 72,000 Kodachromes sitting outside of Paris in Albert Kahn's Archives de la Planète. And there was a book written about the Archives de la Planète by someone in cinema studies who did not talk at all about the color Kodachromes, because I guess, well, she's in film studies, so she didn't want to talk about the still images sitting in the archive, and treated only the films that are in Albert Kahn's Archives of the Planet. But again, there are an amazing number of these very interesting, visually, I think, striking, we don't have time to go on about how beautiful the Kodachromes are, but I think there's a lot to say about color in the Kodachrome, and also about how color really, these Kodachromes transform our idea of what 1900 looked like. Also, National Geographic has an archive of 11,000 Kodachromes to this day. Alfred Stieglitz, in response to seeing Kodachromes made by Steichen himself, who was in Paris in 1907, learned about the Kodachromes and made Kodachromes, Stieglitz said, "Soon the world will be color mad." Yet, modern photo color really begins with Kodachrome, which also was made first for movie cameras and then for still cameras in 1936. There's also Agfacolor in Germany, Fujicolor in Japan, but again, I don't have time to go on about the differences of their methods and how the war affected everything, but we'll just say that Kodachrome was, and this is important, was a reversal film that yielded positive transparencies. In other words, color was slides. It wasn't, in fact, even until 1941 that there were color prints, and that Kodacolor made, something called a color positive, so that, it was out of a color negative. In other words, color was not just slides, color was also Kodak. And color got a huge boost. Oh, this is a colorama. This, for 40 years in Grand Central Station, stood the largest slide in the world, an 18-foot by 60-foot backlit transparency called the colorama. And this is just one example of the colorama, all coloramas had, of course, someone taking a picture in it, because they were, in a sense, an advertisement for Kodak color film. So again, there's a very long history from the slides and the ectochromes through the colorama, but that's not really my subject today, but at least I want you to be aware of it and that this shaped my thinking. But of course, as I said, color photography got a huge boost in 1939 World's Fair at the Kodak Pavilion. In fact, one observer said, color photography is just a giant business, and it's called Kodak. So despite being more expensive, initially 3 times more expensive than black and white film, by 1964, more pictures were taken in color than in black and white in America and in Europe. So this technical and material history of color leads us to better understand its alienation, I think, from fine art photography, and also its potentially natural association with press photography. Color photography had almost no small-scale darkroom practice to speak of. And this is also true of news pictures, by the way, because press photographers would send their films home while they stayed in the field. They had nothing to do with the darkroom. So color photography thus kind of shares a perceived deficiency with press photography in the eyes of those who have an investment in darkroom printing, such as fine arts photographers. Color also had a special compositional challenge. Like the Kodachrome before it, color film required very long exposure times, and it needed lots of control, especially around lighting. So to these material dimensions of color photography, cost, slow exposure time, lighting challenge, the darkroom problems, we also have to add the history of color printing, which is at the heart of color reproduction in all fields, from engraving to photography. So in other words, when you understand color photography, you can't really think about its influence or shape without thinking about color print. So perhaps this is why color photography is so vulgar. It takes a village to produce. But this aspect makes it, I think, natural for the press culture to now, that I want to turn to now. So the news has always been illustrated. But the mid-19th century founding of the London Illustrated News in 1842 and l'Illustration the next year in France gave rise to a new era of integrated wood engravings in every issue, and by the second decade of the 20th century, it was the news photo that emerged as the key form of pictorial eyewitness. Such astute observers of the press as Walter Lippmann, in his seminal account of the power and the importance of the press in a democratic society, Public Opinion, 1922, argued, quote, that photographs have the kind of authority over imagination today, which the printed word had yesterday and the spoken word before that, unquote. Where once the engraved image illustrated the written news story, I would say in a fundamentally supporting role, the photographic image eventually took on steam as the main event, and not what we'll call mere illustration. Despite the rise of the news photo, though, press history has focused almost exclusively on the written word. If you do the history of the press, it is all about the written word, which is a problem of mere, let's call it, field orientation. Scholars of journalism write about what people wrote. And then it's also, though, one of archives. Why? Because news images are separated from the publications that printed them, either because they were provided from, to those publications, or because they literally, physically are kept in a separate place. And also, and I think really interestingly, this story leads to a kind of fragility, which of course, of even the materials of the press, newspapers and magazines, which has led to the greatest bungle in the history of, I would say, historical documentation in the 20th century, certainly for the history of the press, and that is the creation of what I will call a colorblind archival project. So in other words, this is the world, periodical from 1900, but this is how almost every scholar who tries to do research on the world sees it, which is to say the microfilm. So the pulping of newspapers, magazines, in favor of their storage on microfilm, before digital scanning, of course, led to this. And so I would say one of the reasons that this is an impoverished subject and topic is because actually the archive is a big problem. There is an interesting collection that I have yet to visit at Michigan State of the Chicago Tribune's color collection. And the Chicago Tribune was very important in newsprint color. Why? Because Chicago had very important print facilities. So in other words, it's not about the news and it's not about photography, it's about ink. Chicago is an important place, as it were, for color ink and for its industrial manufacture and reproduction. There are other kinds of archival challenges when it comes to color photos. For example, the Magnum photo agency actually used to file their color transparencies, they still do, by subject rather than by story or by photographer. Why? Because it made it easier to reuse and sell the images. You know, dog. Okay, well, let's give them a dog picture, not dog by Kappa. So all the color were not associated with who took the picture or when the picture was originally taken or any relationship to it as a news image, but more a kind of image already anticipated to be reused and resold. Also, there are no contact sheets in color photography. They're slides, they're transparencies. And of course, this, again, makes a different kind of practice than the practice of people printing contact sheets and having contact sheets around. So if this archival conundrum were not enough, the yellow kid, a character that became, caught up in the circulation wars of Pulitzer and Hearst and, represented the basest form of the popular press, what we call yellow journalism, who comes from the yellow kid, and this gave color in the newspaper a bad name before anybody could imagine that color photographs would actually be published in newspapers. Now I'm going to very briefly address the dailies. Here, the midweek pictorial of the New York Times had color at least as early as 1924, because I found this of King Tut's tomb. Again, I've only begun to do research on this. There were color news photos here, the Chicago Tribune, claiming this is a reprint, as it were, of their first color newspaper image, which was of a fire, and I'll say a little bit more about that, because the best known and what most people argue is the first color image, but it's not, it's actually this one, but anyway, is of the Hindenburg explosion. And in 1937, these were supposedly the first color news pictures. They flew the film, and it had a little geographic story. I'm interested in airplanes, so this is the kind of stuff I'm picking up on. They had to fly the film to Rochester. So it's a good thing that, it happened where it did, so they could quickly get a plane to Rochester, develop the film, and then have it reproduced in the Sunday Mirror. The Mirror was the first all-photographic newspaper in the United States. So Death of a Giant, the exclusive color photo record of the destruction of the Hindenburg. And I think what's interesting and important, and I certainly don't have a complete history of color in the dailies, but fire is a favorite subject of news photography. Why? Well, I would argue that the conflagration is the ultimate moment in any event, and its fleeting quality is especially depicted and understood when represented in color. In other words, it looks like kind of smoke in black and white, as it were, but to see the flame, as you know, there's nothing more ephemeral, as it were, than the flame. And that's a long, we could get into Bachelard if you want, but the point is that's a long story that I think newspapers are thematizing here and representing. So despite this kind of buried newspaper history that I've really only begun to uncover, it's also fair to say that weekly magazines are more important for this subject, because they privileged not only color news photos, because they privileged the photo story as their distinction. In other words, these publications were photographically oriented to begin with. Their news cycle was already longer than the dailies, the print production of higher quality than newsprint, and they were, of course, very advertising revenue dependent, more so even than the dailies. So they were willing to kind of sell variety as much as red-hot news, and color added, in a sense, to that dimension of the news, that you are always in the magazine selling the new technology of color. It's also important to understand that Kodachrome and Life magazine are born literally in the same year. Yet what we know of the great photo magazines are really the classic black and white pictures, and here I'll just throw on the famous Kappa D-Day pictures. We will skip the blurry, fact that they were melted, supposedly. in England. There's now, it was the 70th anniversary, as you probably know, of D-Day, and now people are challenging whether he ever took more than just 11 pictures and whether it was true that the picture, the emulsion melted, and that's why they're fuzzy. So if you're interested in that, you can find that whole controversy on the internet. But what I want to draw your attention to is this famous photographer, Robert Capa, most celebrated photojournalist of the kind of heroic period of press photography. When he met his tragic end, which he did by stepping on a landmine in Vietnam in 1954, he was wearing two cameras, one with which to take black and white, and the other color. And this is Robert Capa's last photograph. So again, we don't think of Capa as a colorist, but Capa took many, many photographs in color, and the ICP actually last year did a Capa color show. Now, Capa also was among life's earliest color news pictures because in 1938, Wilson Hicks, the executive director of Life, and Edward Thompson, its picture editor, asked Capa to go take color pictures for them because they wanted to test its use in the field. There were many unknown elements about how the film would stand up to bad weather conditions, what happened when there's a long delay between its exposure and its developing. And they got that idea based on photos that had been sent to them by a Swiss guy named Walter Bossard, and this is of the Sino-Japanese War, and you can see, color and black and white never live on the same page, of course, and this, to give you an up-close and personal image, is a young, needless to say, Mao Zedong. And so Capa took these pictures in Hankow in 1938, and what's really interesting is, first of all, no one mentions in this news that these were published 2 months after they had been taken. Here's the spread. These are, by the way, published long before the FSA started taking color pictures, and I would suggest, I think, that perhaps the publication in 1938 of Color in Life might have influenced the FSA. But so these images are kind of interesting. The article says that the spectacle of a bombed city can't be adequately reproduced without its colors. And these captions that you're going to see, that I'm going to talk about here, the slums of Hankow, capital of China's retreating government, are red with flame and black with smoke after a Japanese bombing, in case you didn't notice it. In other words, what is interesting about these images and how they are presented in the magazine is that the captions are essentially showing that color is descriptive, or at least they're describing using color descriptively. A blue-shirted coolie woman sits in bleak, and here a red fire pump comes to the rescue. So in other words, color, I think, is represented in Life initially as providing more information. And of course, information undergirded the journalistic enterprise. So you can see the interest in color. Now, by the 1960s, color became so integral to the practice of news photographers that John Morris, who was the executive editor of Magnum, asked all of his photographers on assignment to carry two cameras, one in black and white, one with black and white film, and the other in color. Now, 25 years after Hankow, Larry Burroughs covered Vietnam for Life and presented color, interestingly, in much the same way. Here's a quote from the article. "Back came this week's pictures showing, as only color can, the blood and mud and savagery of war." In 1938, I think the fact of color sold magazines, but in 1963, magazines now had to compete with black and white television as a news source, and thus color became all the more valued as kind of a specific thing that magazines could offer. And here I just show you a little bit of that layout. But there was a simultaneously negative discourse around color's use among photojournalists. So Eddie Adams, who took this famous picture, which by the way was first shown as a TV news report, not a photograph by Eddie Adams, so you know the still icon, but actually America first confronted this image as a moving image, as film. But anyway, Eddie Adams, who took this Saigon execution picture, said, quote, "I think all war should be done in black and white. It's more primitive. Color tends to make things look too nice. It makes the jungle in Vietnam look lush." Well, which it was, but it wasn't nice. The reporter, Milt Orshevsky, who accompanied Burroughs in the Far East, had actually a more sophisticated analysis. He thought color was good for the spectacle part, the chopper patterns, the rockets firing, and the black and white for the human part, the emotions, the fatigue, the tension. And yet the magazine essentially printed it's the entire essay in color, as much of the essay as they could in color. So again, I don't have a lot of time to linger on these. Maybe in the Q&A we can talk more about them, but I want to kind of move on fairly quickly to talk about the struggle over photographic control in color, because when you add color as information, the photographer has less control over composition, because he did not determine the interrelation of colors in the real world. So one reason color photography is so quickly adopted in advertising, everyone always says, oh, color is about consumption and advertising, but no one, to my knowledge, has basically made a formal argument about this, not Sally Stein as well, which is to say, why color is used in advertising is because advertising photography is completely contrived. It's not the real world, and so photographers could manipulate color exactly as they wished. A way of thinking about this is as Look magazine's editor, Arthur Rothstein, put it, the publicist makes a picture and a newsman takes the picture. So as Ernst Haas explained, color is really basically much more difficult because it's an addition. If you would have to photograph the President of the United States, and next to him there's a man in a red pullover, everyone would be looking at the man in the red sweater. And so such challenges became the basis of the career of Ernst Haas, who I want to talk about at the end of this paper now, who exploded onto the magazine photography scene in the post-war era to much acclaim, but who subsequently fell out of favor. So although critic Max Kosloff otherwise took a positive view of color photography, he really hated Haas. He said he had taken it into his head that color photography should be about not the sensations, but the sensationalizing of color. His multiple styles were all aflutter with the meringues and frappés of a hyped-up palette. So Haas's interest in color, I would say, was not merely to engage a technical problem. He argued that color would define the age in which he lived for symbolic reasons. And I quote him, he said, "I will remember all the war years and the last 5 bitter post-war years as black and white years. But I wanted to express that the world and life had changed, as at the beginning of a new spring. I wanted to celebrate in color." So Haas, I'm suggesting, was tapping into a very deep color, or cultural rather, reservoir. Even Kappa said, we have to shoot more in color. This again should not be indiscriminate, but we should focus on subjects which demand color. So we start to see the way in which the interest in color also starts to drive the idea that there are certain subjects that are better for color than others. Now, in the same year that Kappa said that, Haas, who was a rising talent at the Magnum photo agency that Kappa founded, showed Life editors his first color photographs among the many black and white ones he had taken for an article about New Mexico. In the Haas photos, Life editors saw a knack for understanding subjects that demanded color. The magazine then commissioned him to do a spread about New York that they published in an unprecedented 24-page, 2-issue story called Images of a Magic City. Now here I just want to show you the kind of problem of the red sweater problem, or what Haas described as the color standing out. So this is a May Day rally in Tokyo, and what you see are not, in a way, the mass of people. What you see are the red flags, I'd suggest. So this is the kind of composition challenge in using color in the real world. So Images of a Magic City is kind of the story that made Haas famous. Haas was an Austrian of some Jewish descent, enough Jewish descent that he had to get kicked out of medical school, etc., who burst onto the photo scene when a story he did for Heute, the American photo magazine in Germany, about the homecoming of prisoners, was republished in Life in 1949. And here's the Life reprint, and what's interesting, I just want to draw your attention, that's the Haas photo that everybody loves, the one I've kind of colored in red. Interestingly, here it is in the from the archival image. So, of course, what you see is that the magazine transposed the image, and that also is something that when you deal with the photojournalism, for scholars who only work on the magazines, and then they make claims about what the photographer's intention was formally, well, they should at least try to figure out what the original image also looked like, and to try to understand if the photographer had anything to do with the print image, because mostly they didn't. Photo editors chose layouts, made layouts. Photographers had nothing to do. Ernst Haas had nothing to do with what this looked like in the magazine. So the success of Magic City led to many color articles, and within a few years, Haas was named one of the top 10 most important photographers in the world in 1958. And I should say, by the way, that 9 out of the 10 most important photographers are press photographers, not art photographers. He was president of Magnum in 1959 to 1962. He wrote and hosted a PBS television program, The Art of Seeing, and MoMA dedicated an exhibition, as I said early in this presentation, to his work in 1962. For the New York assignment, he shot 150 rolls of color. And what was very interesting, actually, is that he then went to Life, and he actually did a slideshow for them of all of his images, although he still didn't actually choose them. Now, if you want to, I'm going to have to be very brief here because we're coming to the end, but if you want to say what did Haas do in his work, he used color to render the city, I would say, both beautiful and unfamiliar. Many of the images, such as this, of the this is just a close-up of this poster, but here, for example, many images, such as the United Nations on the left, used reflections to suggest that viewers should look beyond the subject represented in order to look more deeply. Also, cropping and close-up in these pictures produce an emphasis, I think, on sharp geometry of line and shadow, as one of the caption reads. But I think what's interesting is that the Magic City images used color to foreground depth, as in here, the balustrade image with staircase. So this is a way in which color can shape, as it were, form behind, the other plane. So you see the window and then the balustrade, and that's really color that's, I think, doing that work of what we would think of as form so often that the reader really had no idea what they were looking at. So that here, if you look up here, this is actually a reflection of the Atlas sculpture at Rock Center, mirrored through a shop window and overlapping with a bit of St. Patrick's Cathedral. Now, other images in the essays contrasted objects in ironic and playful ways. And again, I could, do a 30-minute talk on each one of the things I'm going to show you, but I don't have time to. So I just want you to be thinking about the way in which color and the play of light and dark dominated many of these images: street signs, cars here, painted billboards, and this, one of my favorite, the multicolor reflection made when oil spreads on water. So these images, I think, turn the problem of color control into one reframed by the photographer's skillful eye. Now, Haas suggested that color even changed the most important of photojournalistic notions, that of the decisive moment, which, if you're not familiar with it, kind of Henri Cartier-Bresson described as a kind of sixth sense of the photojournalist. He knew when to take the picture. Haas said that color leads the viewer to consider what lies between moments rather than within a moment. He said, "I am fascinated by dynamic time and the change from a three-dimensional world into a two-dimensional image with four-dimensional awareness. Color offered the occasion to see as the eye sees, not in fixed images, but in a blended flow of color." It is not inconsequential that Haas originally wanted to be a filmmaker, and his work in color facilitated his consideration of motion. Color puts still photography on the move. That's my argument. In many of his subsequent photo essays, he experimented with blurring images to make what was static appear dynamic. Here, the beginning of his experimentation with blurring in Paris, here in Venice, here an entire life essay dedicated to his work called The Magic of Color in Motion. He had to use slow shutter speed to avoid underexposure, but this made it impossible to freeze the action, and so he started to pan his still camera. And essentially, the blur signals action and motion. He said, to follow a movement with the camera is as obvious as following a movement with one's eyes. So here he did a series of very famous bullfight pictures called Beauty in a Brutal Art, and all of them employ Haas's use of what we'll call blurred images to describe motion in photography. in still photography. So a reader wrote to Life the next week or the next 2 weeks after saying, Haas is a genius. No one can deny this is art. The page seems to plunge you right into the symphony of color and motion. In these color photos, I'm suggesting that Haas interrogated time and motion in ways that were simultaneously true to life without relying on the realism of photography or the alleged objectivity of journalism. So Haas may have defined color photography as a photo whose subject is color, but he had a strong sense of what color would reveal. He wrote, in the creation of the color image, we discover the fleeting and transitory nature of color and of light. So such statements lead us to understand how Haas sought to make images in a way drawn from the world rather than images of the world. He remarked that color photography presented an image of a fact, heightened by imagination, not an illusion which becomes a truth, as in painting. So these cannot be and should not be understood, I would say, as painterly. And I think these are some of the critical reviews after the fact, and these are true misunderstandings and misinterpretations of this kind of work. In fact, Haas remained wedded to the idea that photography revealed fact. Now I'm going to move very quickly to say that his proximity, and all these photographers' proximity to film, was not merely imagined or illusionary. He was one of 8 photographers to participate in an important Magnum contract to photograph a very ill-fated and famous movie, John Huston's The Misfits. He also was on the set of West Side Story, here employing his blurred photography. And I don't have time to dwell on this, but I do want to point out, again, a real weakness in art history that insists on treating the history of photography separately. This is a very famous picture of Robert Capa, who is, of course, his camera here is a movie camera, not a still camera. And he took films. He, in fact, went to Israel and made a film for the UJA in 1949, which is amazing. There was something called Magnum Films, a division founded in 1962. So treating these media separately really is kind of insane, because actually the people themselves were using different kinds of cameras. So last example is when Dino De Laurentiis asked John Huston to direct an enormous production of the Bible. The director asked Ernst Haas to film the opening sequence of the film. And he sent him around the world with a crew of 4, and this was when Haas actually took up a movie camera. And here I just want to show you the beginning. So it's the first 15 minutes of this film. It's the creation of the world in 15 minutes. And again, I want to just give you some familiarity visually with it. I'm going to take you to the middle, to my favorite lava scenes, which of course he's using a filter here, needless to say, a red filter on this scene of the creation of the world, which includes lava. So this again is Ernst Haas, the photojournalist, working in, an international production of the Bible. And in fact, these pictures became the basis of a project called The Creation, 1971, which sold 350,000 copies. It was the best-selling photo book in the history of the world up to that time. So, a guy you never heard of. Isn't that amazing? So anyway, Haas extended the essayistic and personal nature of magazine reporting. Color offered the opportunity to consider what could be done with photography without eschewing painterliness as a betrayal of the higher value of medium specificity. Color could also allow news photographs to transcend the limitations of working with the still image in an era when widescreen film and color television was drawing public attention. Haas proposed that news photographers, seemingly dedicated to the news as a series of decisive moments, could instead capture the motion that characterized their own fast-moving world. So to conclude, Haas may have sought to make photos rather than take photos, but he didn't question his commitment to representing the world outside his viewfinder. In other words, color news pictures didn't simply deliver more information about the world in the 60s. As news photographs transitioned from black and white to color, photographers like Haas sought to create color consciousness in press photography. He said, "We must call for less description, more imagination, less information, more suggestion, less prose, more poetry." In other words, Haas used color to ask viewers to look more deeply through the reporter's eye rather than simply through the camera's lens. Now, more than 20 years before the consecration of color in fine art photography with the William Eggleston MoMA show, which still falsely, and you can see it on Amazon.com, said the first one-man show in color, which is just false. Anyway, before this consecrated false moment, color news pictures challenged firm distinctions between reporting and pictorialism, news, and art. Further, what I'm hoping, other than telling this story, is that this investigation of news pictures, color news pictures, also opens our eyes to a different history of both news pictures and of color photography. Haas had that 1962 one-man show, yet the curator, John Sarkowski, worked tirelessly to rewrite photo history and write out the important role played by news pictures, by news color, in the development of color photography and color fine art photography more generally. But if you write this story back into the history, as I hope I've begun to do today, we will not only learn about the news in color, but we will also learn to look at stuff like documentary photographer Helen Levitt's color photos, and of course those FSA photos as well. Photography, in other words, long ago, went from black and white to color, offering, as this 1955 magazine article about Haas put it, adventures in seeing. Thanks.